By the mid-1580s, Europe was a continent divided. The Protestant Reformation had splintered Christendom, and the lines between religion, politics, and empire were blurred. Spain, under King Philip II, stood as the champion of Catholic power. Its empire stretched from the silver-rich mountains of Peru to the spice-laden ports of the Philippines. With the gold and silver from the Americas pouring into its treasuries, Spain fielded the most formidable army in Europe and a vast navy of galleons, towering ships built for carrying soldiers, treasure, and the authority of the Spanish crown. Across the English Channel, Queen Elizabeth I ruled a smaller but increasingly ambitious kingdom. England had embraced Protestantism, rejecting papal authority entirely. This religious divide alone was enough to keep the two crowns suspicious of one another. But in the decades after Elizabeth's accession in 1558, tensions escalated beyond mere mistrust. English privateers, men like Sir Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher, roamed the Atlantic hunting Spanish treasure ships. Officially, Elizabeth denied sanctioning piracy. Unofficially, she invested in these ventures and took a share of the plunder. To Spain, these sea dogs were criminals. To England, they were heroes defending national honor and undermining a powerful enemy. The conflict deepened in 1570, when Pope Pius V issued a papal bull excommunicating Elizabeth, declaring her illegitimate and releasing her subjects from obedience. This was more than theology. It was a political green light for Catholic powers, especially Spain, to intervene in England. For Philip II, who had once been married to Elizabeth's Catholic half-sister Mary I, there was now not only a religious duty, but also a dynastic claim. In the Netherlands, Spain's troubles multiplied. The Dutch provinces, many of them Protestant, rebelled against Philip's rule in 1568. The 80 Years' War had begun. By the early 1580s, the Dutch rebels, under constant Spanish assault, sought foreign aid. Elizabeth hesitated at first, wary of provoking war, but Spanish military successes convinced her that if the Netherlands fell entirely under Philip's control, England's own security would be at risk. In August 1585, she signed the Treaty of Nonsuch, pledging English military support to the Dutch. Troops under Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, were dispatched. For Philip, this was the final provocation. England was no longer a covert irritant. It had become an open enemy. Plans for a massive invasion fleet, an armada that would carry tens of thousands of soldiers across the Channel, began to take shape. The goal was clear: overthrow Elizabeth, end Protestant rule in England, and restore the realm to Catholic obedience. Naval warfare in the 1580s stood on the edge of transformation. Spain's heavy galleons, designed for boarding actions, carried large numbers of soldiers but fewer heavy guns. England's newer warships were lighter, faster, and mounted long-range naval artillery capable of delivering sustained broadsides. This difference in design philosophy would prove decisive in the years ahead. By the end of 1585, both nations were moving toward war. In Spain's ports, carpenters and caulkers worked day and night to prepare ships. In England, shipyards along the Thames and in Plymouth readied the Queen's fleet, while private investors armed their own vessels in hopes of profit. Across the narrow waters of the Channel, two very different empires were on a collision course. The storm that would be remembered as the Anglo-Spanish War was about to break. The war had not yet officially begun, but the sea was already alive with skirmishes. In the spring of 1587, Sir Francis Drake, England's most feared and celebrated privateer, was sent on a mission that would become one of the most daring preemptive strikes in naval history. Elizabeth's orders were carefully worded, avoiding open declaration of war, but the intent was unmistakable: cripple Spain's preparations for the planned invasion of England before the Armada could sail. Drake's fleet left Plymouth in April 1587 with only about 30 ships, a mix of royal vessels and armed merchantmen. His target was Cadiz, one of Spain's most important naval ports, where dozens of galleons were gathering supplies, weapons, and provisions for the Armada. The Spanish believed their harbor was secure. No enemy fleet had ever dared to attack so deep into their own waters. On April 29th, Drake entered Cadiz Bay with the tide and wind at his back. His ships moved in quickly, catching the Spanish completely off guard. For the next 2 days, English gunners poured shot into the anchored fleet, setting ships ablaze and forcing others aground. By the time Drake withdrew, at least 30 Spanish ships had been destroyed or captured, along with enormous quantities of naval supplies, timber, barrels, and provisions intended for the Armada. Drake called it "singing the King of Spain's beard," a phrase that would echo through English taverns and ballads. The strike delayed Spanish preparations by more than a year, forcing Philip to rebuild and reprovision his fleet. But Drake did not stop at Cadiz. He cruised along the Iberian coast, seizing merchant ships and destroying more supplies in Lisbon and other ports. His fleet then sailed to the Azores, intercepting a rich Portuguese carrack loaded with spices, silks, and treasures from the East Indies, a prize worth a fortune. In Spain, the raid was a humiliation. The greatest naval power in Europe had been struck at home, its harbors violated. Philip II's resolve hardened. He poured even more resources into the Armada project, determined not only to punish England, but to avenge the insult. The Spanish crown began assembling ships from every corner of its empire, from the Mediterranean to the New World. Shipwrights labored without pause, and orders went out for the collection of soldiers, sailors, and artillery from across Spain, Italy, and the Spanish Netherlands. In England, Drake's raid was celebrated as a masterstroke. It bought the kingdom precious time to prepare coastal defenses, reinforce the navy, and train gunners. Lord Charles Howard of Effingham was appointed Lord High Admiral, overseeing the Royal Navy's organization. Under him served Drake as Vice Admiral, John Hawkins as Treasurer of the Navy, and Martin Frobisher as a squadron commander, a team of seasoned mariners whose experience in long voyages and privateering would prove critical. Yet, the lull brought by Drake's attack was deceptive. By the end of 1587, intelligence reports confirmed that Philip was gathering an even larger fleet than before, supported by an army under the Duke of Parma in the Spanish Netherlands. The plan was ambitious. The Armada would sail up the Channel, protect Parma's crossing with tens of thousands of troops, and land them in England for a swift overthrow of Elizabeth's regime. The stage was set for one of the most famous naval confrontations in history. The following year, 1588, would see the full might of the Spanish Armada set sail, and the fate of England would hang in the balance. By the spring of 1588, the Spanish Armada was no longer a plan on paper. It was a vast reality taking shape in Spain's ports. King Philip II's vision was bold and uncompromising. An unstoppable fleet would sail from Spain, link up with the Duke of Parma's army in the Spanish Netherlands, and deliver a crushing blow to Protestant England. The Armada was not merely a military operation. It was a statement of imperial will, backed by the Catholic Church's blessing. The fleet was immense for its time, around 130 ships, ranging from massive galleons and armed merchantmen to lighter supply vessels. They carried over 8,000 sailors, 19,000 soldiers, and thousands of tons of supplies, cannonballs, gunpowder, food, and fresh water for a voyage that could last months. Alongside were priests to administer sacraments, surgeons to tend the wounded, and engineers to build fortifications once landfall was made. The Armada was commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a nobleman of great loyalty but limited naval experience, chosen partly for his political reliability. In England, the news of Spain's preparations spread quickly. The government issued orders to mobilize the fleet. Lord Charles Howard of Effingham, as Lord High Admiral, oversaw the defense. Vice Admiral Sir Francis Drake and Rear Admiral Sir John Hawkins worked to ready the ships. English shipyards were alive with activity, repairing hulls, caulking seams, and stocking powder and shot. Beacons were prepared along the coast to warn of invasion. The English fleet was smaller, with around 200 ships, many privately owned and pressed into service. What the English lacked in size, they made up for in speed and maneuverability. Their warships were sleek, low in the water, and equipped with powerful long-range naval guns. English gunnery tactics favored repeated broadsides from a distance, wearing down the enemy rather than boarding for close combat. This contrasted sharply with Spanish doctrine, which relied on grappling, boarding, and hand-to-hand fighting once alongside the enemy. Philip's plan hinged on perfect coordination between the Armada and Parma's forces. The Armada would clear the channel of English ships, anchor off the Flemish coast, and escort Parma's invasion barges across. But there were obstacles from the beginning. The fleet, originally set to sail in May, was delayed by storms and supply shortages. It was not until late May that the Armada finally left Lisbon, only to be battered by heavy weather in the Bay of Biscay. Damaged ships limped back to port for repairs, costing valuable weeks. It was late July when the Armada finally reached the coast of Cornwall. On July 19, 1588, English lookouts spotted the great crescent of sails on the horizon. Beacons were lit, their flames racing the length of England's southern coast, carrying the warning to London. The country braced for invasion. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. A procession of towering Spanish galleons advancing in tight formation, banners and crucifixes fluttering in the summer breeze. Behind them trailed supply ships and smaller escorts, all moving with slow, deliberate purpose. To many in England, it seemed as though an empire's wrath had taken physical form on the sea. But in those calm waters off Cornwall, the Armada's fate was far from decided. The English fleet, spread across Plymouth and other ports, moved to shadow and harass the Spanish formation. The battle for the Channel, and for England's survival, was about to begin. The Armada's arrival off the coast of Cornwall on July 19, 1588, was the moment England had been preparing for. Lord Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake were anchored at Plymouth with the core of the English fleet when the signal fires lit up the night along the coast. But instead of charging headlong into the Spanish line, the English commanders made a calculated move. They allowed the Armada to pass up channel before putting to sea, positioning themselves with the wind at their backs for the opening engagement. The Spanish formation was a defensive crescent, with the largest galleons forming the horns of the arc, smaller vessels filling the center, and supply ships shielded within. It was an intimidating sight, a wall of oak and iron, sails billowing, and pennants snapping in the wind. Yet its rigid structure limited maneuverability, a weakness the English intended to exploit. On July 21st, the first major engagement took place off Plymouth. English ships, faster and more agile, darted in close enough to fire broadsides and then pulled away before the heavier Spanish guns could bear. The Armada's plan was to avoid heavy fighting until it could meet Parma's forces, but the English refused to allow them a peaceful passage. For 2 days, skirmishes continued, with the English striking at the Armada's flanks and rear, forcing the Spanish to keep their formation tight. One of the most celebrated episodes of the opening battle was Drake's night maneuver on July 21st. After exchanging fire during the day, Drake used the cover of darkness to seize Rosario, a Spanish galleon that had fallen behind due to damage and confusion. The Rosario was a treasure ship carrying supplies, weapons, and gold for the Armada. Its capture boosted English morale and deprived the Spaniards of valuable resources. The Armada continued up channel, but the English harried them constantly. On July 23rd, the two fleets clashed again off Portland Bill. Here, the wind shifted suddenly in the English favor, allowing their ships to close in and unleash heavy gunfire. The English tactic of sustained artillery fire at range was beginning to show its advantage. Spanish hulls were scarred, rigging was torn, and casualties mounted, yet few ships were sunk outright. The English aimed not to destroy the Armada ship by ship, but to wear it down before the decisive moment. Spanish morale was steady but under strain. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, and used to naval combat, relied heavily on his captains, some of whom argued for breaking formation to pursue the English. But Medina Sidonia, knowing Parma awaited them, insisted on maintaining the crescent. This caution preserved the Armada's core strength, but ceded the initiative to the English, who dictated the pace of the fight. By the time the Armada passed the Isle of Portland, the pattern of the campaign was clear. The Spanish could not force a decisive engagement on their terms, and the English would not risk boarding actions where Spanish soldiers could overwhelm them. Instead, the fight was becoming a test of endurance, seamanship, and gunpowder supply. The next stage would bring the fleets to the waters off the Isle of Wight, where English commanders would try to block the Armada from reaching Parma, and where the Spaniards would face a strategic dilemma that could decide the fate of their mission. By late July 1588, the Armada's progress up the English Channel had been slow and costly. Constant harassment by the English fleet forced the Spaniards to remain in their rigid crescent formation, preventing them from using their numerical advantage in soldiers. Now, as they approached the Isle of Wight, The English saw a chance to trap the Armada before it could reach the Duke of Parma's army in the Spanish Netherlands. The Isle of Wight, with its narrow channels and strong tidal currents, offered a potential choke point. If the English could force the Armada toward shallow waters or delay them long enough, the fleet might be scattered or forced into battle under unfavorable conditions. Lord Howard and Sir Francis Drake devised a plan to push the Spanish toward the shore, while maintaining the constant gunnery that was steadily wearing them down. On 25 to 26 July, the two fleets clashed in a running fight. English ships, using the wind to their advantage, repeatedly darted in to fire heavy broadsides at close range before pulling away. The English guns, mounted on lower decks for stability, could fire more rapidly and accurately than the Spanish artillery, which was designed primarily for a single devastating broadside before boarding. Medina Sidonia recognized the danger. If the Armada was forced too close to the Isle of Wight, the risk of grounding or being surrounded increased sharply. He ordered a disciplined withdrawal, steering the Armada away from the English trap. This maneuver avoided disaster but cost the Spaniards precious time and further damaged their ships. Several vessels were badly holed or had rigging destroyed, forcing them to drop out of formation for repairs. Meanwhile, the Duke of Parma waited impatiently in the Netherlands. His invasion barges were ready, but he had no secure port from which to launch them. The English-controlled seas, combined with Dutch rebel ships patrolling the shallow coastal waters, made it impossible for him to move without the Armada's direct protection. Spanish coordination began to falter. Messages between Parma and Medina Sidonia had to be sent by small boats hugging the coast, often delayed by days. By the evening of July 26th, the Armada had managed to pass the Isle of Wight, but was still shadowed by the English fleet. The Spaniards now anchored off Calais, hoping to rendezvous with Parma's forces. The plan was for Parma's army to board the Armada and cross the channel under its escort, but the English had no intention of allowing such a link-up. That night, Howard, Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher gathered aboard the flagship Ark Royal to decide their next move. They knew the Armada's anchorage at Calais was vulnerable. The crowded formation of ships, packed closely together in the roadstead, would be unable to maneuver quickly if attacked. An audacious plan began to take shape, one that would force the Spaniards to break formation and scatter, leaving them open to a decisive English strike. The weapon they would use was not cannon or musket, but fire. On the night of July 28, 1588, the Spanish Armada lay anchored off Calais, a forest of masts and sails silhouetted against the dark waters. Medina Sidonia's plan was simple: wait here for the Duke of Parma's army to arrive, then escort them across the channel for the invasion of England. But the anchorage, though sheltered, placed the Armada in a dangerously tight cluster. Any sudden attack could throw the entire fleet into chaos. Lord Howard and his commanders understood this perfectly. That evening, aboard Ark Royal, they agreed on a bold plan. They would launch fire ships, old vessels packed with pitch, tar, gunpowder, and other flammable materials, set ablaze and sent drifting into the anchored Armada. The idea was not necessarily to destroy ships outright, but to terrify the Spaniards into cutting their anchor cables and scattering, breaking the rigid crescent formation that had thus far kept them safe. In the early hours of July 29th, 8 fire ships slipped silently into the darkness, carried by wind and tide toward the Armada. At first, Spanish lookouts mistook them for ordinary vessels. Then the flames roared to life, illuminating the night. The sight of burning ships drifting straight toward them was enough to spark panic. Shouts and bells rang across the fleet as crews rushed to react. Many captains cut their anchors in haste, desperate to maneuver away from the inferno. The Armada's tight formation disintegrated in minutes. By dawn, the Spanish fleet was scattered and struggling to regroup in the choppy waters off Gravelines. This was the moment the English had been waiting for. Howard, Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher led their squadrons in a full-scale assault. Freed from the threat of boarding, the English warships could unleash their long-range guns without restraint. They maintained constant broadsides, maneuvering in close, and then pulling away before the Spaniards could respond effectively. The Duke of Medina Sidonia fought to rally his ships, but the damage was mounting. Several Spanish vessels, including the San Felipe and the San Mateo, were heavily damaged and forced aground on the shallow Flemish coast. The English gunners targeted the Armada's flagships and large galleons, tearing through hulls and rigging. The battle raged for 8 hours, one of the longest naval engagements of the age. Crucially, the Spanish never managed to close the distance for boarding. English ships, lighter and faster, kept the fight at range, turning the Armada's greatest strength, its large force of soldiers, into a liability. Spanish gun crews, trained for slower, heavier volleys, could not match the English rate of fire. By late afternoon, with the tide turning and ammunition running low, the English began to pull back. But the damage was done. The Armada was crippled, many ships leaking, others dismasted, and morale shaken. Worse, they were now north of Calais, driven away from Parma's army. The rendezvous, the very heart of Philip's invasion plan, was now impossible. Medina Sidonia had no choice but to retreat up the Channel and attempt to return to Spain by sailing around the north of Scotland and down past Ireland. The Armada's fate now rested not in its guns, but in the mercy of the sea, and the Atlantic had no mercy to give. By the spring of 1588, Philip II's grand design was nearing completion. In Lisbon, the port bristled with activity as shipwrights hammered, caulked, and rigged. The mighty fleet, soon to be known as the Grande y Felicissima Armada, was a floating empire in miniature, 130 ships, including mighty galleons, armed merchantmen, and sleek galleasses, carrying nearly 8,000 sailors, 19,000 soldiers, and 2,000 guns. Their mission was to secure control of the English Channel long enough for the Duke of Parma's veteran army, stationed in the Spanish Netherlands, to cross and invade England. It was not to be a mere raid. It was an attempt to unseat Elizabeth I entirely. The plan was ambitious and perilous. Spain's war machine was stretched across the globe, and coordinating a fleet from Lisbon with an army in Flanders, while outmaneuvering the nimble English navy, was a monumental challenge. The Armada's commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, was a loyal courtier but not a seasoned sailor. His appointment was controversial, for Spain's greatest admiral, the experienced Marquis of Santa Cruz, had died unexpectedly months before. Nevertheless, preparations went forward. The Spanish saw the Armada as a holy enterprise, la empresa de Inglaterra, blessed by God to punish a heretic queen and restore Catholic rule. Religious banners fluttered alongside the royal standard, and priests preached fiery sermons on deck before the fleet departed. On May 28, 1588, the Armada finally sailed from Lisbon, its masts and sails rising like a forest against the horizon. The sight impressed even England's spies, an ocean-going fortress bristling with guns, as much a symbol of Spain's power as its colonies and gold fleets. But almost immediately, disaster struck. Storms off Cape Finisterre battered the formation, damaging ships and forcing a delay in Corunna for repairs. This was a bad omen, but the Spanish pressed on, convinced divine favor would see them through. In England, the alarm spread quickly. Beacons blazed across the countryside, flames leaping from hill to hill, signaling that the long-feared invasion was coming. The English fleet, under Lord Howard of Effingham with Sir Francis Drake as vice-admiral, prepared to meet them in the Channel. Elizabeth's navy was smaller in tonnage but faster, better armed for long-range gunnery, and manned by sailors hardened by years of privateering. The clash that was about to unfold was not just a military confrontation. It was a test of two very different naval doctrines: Spain's emphasis on boarding and decisive hand-to-hand fighting, and England's reliance on maneuver and sustained gunnery. The fate of both nations would soon hinge on wind, tide, and powder. Gravelines ca Samandari Maidan Spanish Armada, or English fleet Coup d'Armée en Faisley ca Pal Sabatois. August 8, 1588 KO, English Admiral Sir Francis Drake, Lord Charles Howard, or Unk Southey commanders, any Spanish ships, par ek isa coordinated attack, kia, jo un key naval strategy ka Shandar Namuna the. Armada ob Channel ku Western Edge par Pohanch Chuki t, lekan unka plan ob Pori Terra se Bygar Chuka the. English fleet any apni tes, Chalak galleons ka Phytoathea. Ye ships Spanish ships se Zyada maneuverable t, or tes wind ku Sath apni position Badal Sakti t. Unka strategy simple lekan devastating t, safe distance se Lagatar cannon fire Karna, Spanish ships KO close combat, ka Maucanadina. Thus retaraf Spanish ships, ubb Mediterranean-style ka close quarters boarding warfare, kulia bani huiti. Jo English hit-and-run tactics, ku samni bikar sabit hui. Is battle kashuru hon se peli English, any x smart move kia the unhon fireships ka istimal kia. Yi Pirani ships t Jinhain Jalain ku bad armada ku beach bej diagaya. Rat ku and hear me jab, ye fireships Spanish formation ki terafayi, to panic fail Gaia. Spanish captains, any apney anchors cut car D or harsh ship alag direction me bog Gaia. Is southeast unka tight, defensive crescent formation to Gaia. Jab gravleen me suba hui. English ships any ISS Bikri hui armada ko Gaira, or bearish ki terra cannon fire Barsaya. Battle pura dinchala. English ships any apney long-range naval guns ka pura fido athea, Spanish ships ka masts, rigging, or hulls ko tabacardia. Zyadatar Spanish ships badly damaged ho chuki t, or unk pas ammunition cam t. Sir Francis Drake, ku Galleon Revenge, or Lord Howard ku flagship Ark Royal Nebraska Kuch Sabs, Zyada damage dia. Spanish ship San Martin, Jo Medina Sidonia ka flagship the, any Bohat heavy fire Gila Magar Jishi Terra survive Kargaya. Lekin Bohat si Badi Spanish ships Yita Samundar ki Garayan mi Chali Gaya repair ko Layak Narahi. Gravleen ka Natija ya the ku Armada ko Channel Chode Kar North ki Taraf retreat Karnapada. Scotland Kugum ku Spain Wapas Jane ki Koshishmi. Yi decision Unk Liep Bohat Mehenga Sabit Hua. Kyunk North Atlantic ku Tafani Samundar any Spanish ships ko, or Zyada Tabacardia. Gravleen any surf English naval superiority ko confirm Nahi Kia. Baki Yi clear Cardia ku Spanish ka England par invasion of Mushkil Hai Nai. Lagbag Namumkin Ho Gayatha. Is battle ku bad Elizabeth I any apney forces ko. Tilbury me address Kia. Unca Mashhor speech dia. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. Ye laughs England kulagon kulia ek nara bangay, or Spanish Armada ki, har British national pride ka hamesha ka, symbol bangay. By 1596, the Anglo-Spanish War had dragged on for over a decade, draining treasuries and stretching military manpower across Europe and the high seas. While the Atlantic and Channel had seen intermittent naval clashes, events on the European mainland began to draw both powers into fresh confrontations. One of the most significant of these was the Siege of Calais. Calais, though technically under French control, was of immense strategic value. Sitting on the French coast opposite the English Channel, it had long been a prize for any nation wishing to dominate cross-channel trade and military movement. In the summer of 1596, Spanish forces, under the command of Archduke Albert of Austria, moved to seize the city. The Spanish saw Calais as both a stepping stone toward controlling the English Channel and as leverage in ongoing negotiations with France. The French garrison, under Henri IV of France, was caught off guard. England, bound by alliance to France through the Treaty of Greenwich, 1596, scrambled to send aid. Yet the speed of the Spanish offensive was remarkable. Calais fell within a matter of weeks in late summer, stunning both Paris and London. For England, the loss of Calais to Spain was a geopolitical nightmare. A Spanish-controlled port so close to their southern coast threatened trade routes and opened the possibility of renewed invasion attempts. Elizabeth I responded by ordering the mobilization of the navy and dispatching additional funds and troops to support French efforts to recapture the city. Yet, the English treasury was already under heavy strain. The war had been expensive, and the cost of maintaining fleets year-round was crippling. Moreover, disease and bad weather had taken their toll on England's sailors, reducing the effectiveness of their naval squadrons. The fall of Calais also emboldened Spain diplomatically. Philip II could now present himself as the defender of Catholic interests in Northern Europe, and his forces, despite setbacks in the Atlantic, had secured an important foothold on the Channel. Spanish morale, battered after the Armada disaster and subsequent failed invasions, received a significant boost. However, Calais was not to remain in Spanish hands indefinitely. French forces, backed by English military and financial support, would later retake the city, but the incident demonstrated the war's unpredictability and how quickly the balance of power could shift. It also proved that Spain's military reach was still formidable, and that even in the war's later stages, Philip II was willing to gamble on ambitious campaigns. By the late 1590s, the conflict had become more than just an England-Spain struggle. It was now a tangle of interconnected wars involving France, the Dutch Republic, and even the distant colonies. The Siege of Calais was one more reminder to Elizabeth's court that the war was far from over, and that every gain could be lost just as quickly as it was won. By the end of the 1590s, the long war between Spain and England had drained both kingdoms. Philip II of Spain had launched multiple armadas after the catastrophic defeat of 1588, but each had been met with disaster, storms, disease, and the formidable English defenses. In 1596, Elizabeth I authorized one of England's most audacious offensives, the sack of Cadiz. Led by the Earl of Essex and Lord Admiral Charles Howard, an English fleet penetrated deep into Spanish waters, capturing and burning the port city, destroying ships meant for a new armada. This blow humiliated Spain and showed that English naval power could strike at the heart of its empire. Spain retaliated the following year with another armada, aiming to land forces in Ireland and ignite a Catholic uprising. Yet, storms once again scattered the fleet, and the attempt collapsed before making landfall. Meanwhile, the war's theater expanded to the Americas and Asia, with privateers such as Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Richard Hawkins attacking Spanish holdings overseas. Though profitable for England's seafarers, these raids were pinpricks compared to the massive economic strain of war. By 1601, the conflict had shifted decisively to Ireland, where Spain attempted its final major intervention. A fleet carrying 3,500 troops landed at Kinsale to support Irish rebels during the 9 Years' War. English forces under Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy, besieged the town, forcing the Spanish into a pitched battle. Poor coordination between the Irish and Spanish doomed the effort, and the defeat at Kinsale in January 1602 marked the last serious Spanish attempt to challenge English dominance. Philip II had died in 1598, leaving his son Philip III to inherit a war that no longer promised victory. England, too, was weary. Elizabeth I's treasury was depleted, and her once youthful court had grown old with her. Both sides recognized that the vast costs outweighed the benefits. In 1604, a year after Elizabeth's death, the Treaty of London ended the 19-Year War. The agreement restored peace without major territorial changes, but confirmed England's survival as an independent Protestant power and a growing naval force. The Spanish Armada War, which had begun as a grand Catholic crusade to overthrow Elizabeth, had instead showcased the limits of imperial might in the face of weather, logistics, and determined defense. England emerged emboldened, its sailors seasoned, and its ship design refined, lessons that would be carried into the coming century of colonial expansion. Spain, though still formidable, had suffered blows to its prestige and maritime dominance that would prove irreversible in the long arc of history. By the turn of the 17th century, the war that had begun in 1585 had dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Both England and Spain were exhausted, their treasuries drained, and their people weary of the constant threat of raids, famine, and disease. The prolonged conflict had morphed far beyond the failed Armada of 1588. It had become a grinding, global struggle fought not only in the waters of the English Channel, but across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and deep into the Spanish Netherlands. Philip III of Spain, who had succeeded his father Philip II in 1598, inherited a nation in financial crisis. Years of warfare had crippled Spain's economy, even as it continued to receive treasure fleets from the Americas. Inflation, corruption, and the sheer cost of maintaining garrisons in the Netherlands, Italy, and overseas colonies stretched the Spanish crown to its limits. England, too, was showing signs of strain. The privateering ventures that had once brought vast profits to English investors were becoming less lucrative. Spanish convoys had adapted, traveling in larger, more heavily defended formations, making interception far riskier. The Irish 9 Years' War, 1594 to 1603, had become an especially draining front for Elizabeth. The rebellion, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, was bolstered by Spanish support, and in 1601, Spain landed a force at Kinsale in southern Ireland. This move threatened to turn Ireland into a permanent Spanish foothold, potentially allowing a future invasion of England from across the Irish Sea. The English response was swift but costly. In December 1601, at the Battle of Kinsale, Lord Mountjoy and Sir George Carew besieged the town, defeating the combined Irish and Spanish forces in a decisive battle that effectively ended serious Spanish ambitions in Ireland. The defeat at Kinsale was a turning point. It made clear to Spain that further attempts to subdue England or establish a base in Ireland would be both costly and unlikely to succeed. At the same time, England, under Elizabeth's aging leadership, had to reckon with the reality that its war aims, weakening Spain enough to secure Protestant dominance in Europe, had not been fully achieved. Elizabeth's once fiery resolve to keep the war going was dimmed by years of attrition and the mounting costs of maintaining a strong naval presence. Negotiations, which had occasionally flickered during the war, took on new urgency after Elizabeth's death in March 1603. Her successor, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, was far more inclined toward peace. He had no personal vendetta against Spain and believed that ending the costly war would stabilize his new kingdom. Spanish envoys, aware of England's war fatigue and their own nation's financial desperation, were willing to meet him halfway. The result was the Treaty of London, signed in August 1604. The agreement brought the Anglo-Spanish War to an end. Its terms were not overly punitive to either side. England agreed to cease support for the Dutch rebels in the Spanish Netherlands, while Spain abandoned its support for Irish rebels and accepted England's right to trade freely in most parts of the world, though it retained control over the Spanish-American trade monopoly. While the treaty ended hostilities, it did not erase the deep rivalry between the two nations. Spain remained a dominant naval power, and England, though still smaller in global reach, had emerged with a stronger maritime tradition and a reputation for defying the mightiest empire of the day. The war's legacy was not merely military. It helped forge the English identity as a Protestant maritime power, set against Catholic Spain, a theme that would echo through the 17th century. For Spain, the war marked the first major check to its imperial dominance, a harbinger of the slow decline that would follow in later decades. For England, it was a proving ground, a crucible in which its future as a seafaring empire was forged. The cannons had fallen silent, but the age of guns and galleons had only just begun. As the century turned, the war between England and Spain had already transformed both nations. The defeat of the Armada in 1588 had been a dramatic chapter, but it had not ended the conflict. Instead, the years that followed were marked by raids, counter-raids, and the shifting alliances of Europe in religious and political turmoil. By 1600, Spain was still the greatest power on earth, its empire stretching from the silver mines of Potosi to the spice islands of the East Indies. But cracks were beginning to show in the Habsburg crown's gilded surface. The relentless cost of war, the drain of treasure fleets, and the constant threat from Dutch, French, and English privateers gnawed at Spanish stability. In England, the situation was equally complex. Elizabeth I's coffers were never deep, and her support for Protestant rebels in the Netherlands and France had left her realm entangled in continental politics. The English navy, though bolstered by victories, had to be maintained at great expense, and merchant ventures in the New World carried as much risk as reward. Nevertheless, the daring raids of captains like Sir Walter Raleigh and the Earl of Essex kept English morale high, and the legend of 1588 was carefully nurtured as proof that God favored Protestant England. Naval clashes continued. In 1596, the English and Dutch combined fleets captured the Spanish port of Cadiz, dealing a humiliating blow to Philip II. But in 1597, a Spanish fleet attempted another invasion, this time targeting Ireland, where Catholic rebels sought Spanish aid against the English crown. Poor weather once again scattered the Spanish ships, but the attempt revealed that the war was far from over. Meanwhile, privateers like Christopher Newport and George Clifford, Earl of Cumberland, struck at Spanish possessions in the Caribbean, taking valuable prizes and disrupting trade. On land, the war's other major front unfolded in Ireland. The 9 Years' War, 1594 to 1603, saw the Irish chieftain Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, lead a formidable rebellion against English rule, supported by Spanish arms and advisors. In 1601, Spain landed a force at Kinsale in southern Ireland, hoping to coordinate with O'Neill's forces. The decisive Battle of Kinsale followed, where English forces under Lord Mountjoy surrounded and defeated the combined Irish-Spanish army. The failure at Kinsale marked the last serious attempt by Spain to invade the British Isles. Philip II died in 1598, passing the crown to his son Philip III. Less inclined toward relentless war, the new king faced pressing problems at home, from economic stagnation to political unrest in his far-flung empire. In England, Elizabeth's own health was failing, and many feared what would come after her reign. Both nations were weary, their treasuries strained, and their people tired of decades of conflict. By 1604, the logic of peace could no longer be ignored. Philip III and the new English king, James I, agreed to the Treaty of London, ending nearly 2 decades of intermittent naval warfare. The treaty restored commercial relations and halted open hostilities, though privateering would continue under different guises. While neither side could claim total victory, England had proven that it could withstand the might of Spain, and Spain had demonstrated that it remained a formidable force despite setbacks. The war's legacy was complex. For England, the conflict cemented the reputation of its navy and fueled a growing sense of national identity tied to the sea. For Spain, it marked the beginning of a slow but perceptible decline from its 16th-century zenith. The legend of the Spanish Armada, battered by storms, scattered by English fire, would echo through history as a symbol of shifting power in the early modern world. Yet in truth, the war had been far more than one famous battle. It was a protracted struggle of economies, alliances, and strategies, fought across oceans and continents, whose lessons would shape the future of naval warfare. By the opening of the 17th century, the war that had begun with the thunder of cannon and the clash of nations had become a slow, grinding contest of attrition. Spain's once proud navy, though still formidable on paper, had suffered from decades of relentless strain. Shipwrecks, storms, enemy raids, and the ever-rising costs of the empire had drained the royal treasury. England, too, was not immune to fatigue. War had been expensive, and the political winds were shifting, but the English still held the advantage in morale and strategic flexibility. Philip II of Spain remained determined to restore his naval supremacy and punish England for its defiance. Several attempts to rebuild the Armada were launched in the 1590s. New fleets were assembled, new galleons commissioned, and veterans recalled from service across the empire. Yet the sheer scale of the losses after 1588 meant that many of these armadas were shadows of the original force, smaller, hastily armed, and manned with crews who often lacked the training of their predecessors. The costs of war in Flanders, the defense of the Americas, and the constant need to protect trade routes against Dutch and English privateers meant resources were spread thin. In 1601, a final major Spanish attempt to project naval power into English waters unfolded. This time, the strategic goal was Ireland. Ireland had long been a potential weak point for England, a Catholic nation under Protestant English rule, with many clans still resistant to London's authority. Spain saw an opportunity to land troops, join forces with Irish rebels under Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and open a new front that could destabilize Elizabeth's kingdom from within. The Spanish fleet managed to land a force at Kinsale in southern Ireland, but the plan quickly unraveled. The English navy, still maintaining tight patrols in home waters, intercepted Spanish reinforcements, while on land, Lord Mountjoy's army closed in on the invaders. The decisive Battle of Kinsale in January 1602 ended in English victory, and the dream of using Ireland as a springboard against England collapsed. At sea, England's maritime raiding continued to gnaw at Spanish power. Privateers struck deep into the Caribbean, raiding ports in Cuba, Panama, and the coasts of New Spain. Spanish convoys became more cautious, traveling in heavily armed formations, yet the constant threat slowed trade and bled the empire's finances. By the death of Philip II in 1598 and the accession of his son Philip III, Spain's war aims had shifted from conquest to damage control. England, though financially strained, had achieved what it most needed: the preservation of its independence, the weakening of Spain's prestige, and the growth of its naval reputation. The final years of the conflict saw fewer large-scale sea battles, but the war's shadow loomed over every decision in Madrid and London. Both kingdoms understood that without peace, they risked exhausting themselves to the point of collapse. Yet for over a decade, the guns and galleons had defined the age, reshaping the balance of power across Europe and the oceans. It was becoming clear that the Spanish dream of overwhelming England at sea had been broken, not in a single battle, but in the long, grinding test of endurance between two nations bound by rivalry, religion, and the tides of empire. By the first years of the new century, the once blazing fire of the Anglo-Spanish conflict had dimmed into a long, grinding glow, still dangerous, still costly, but lacking the great thunderclaps of the Armada years. Both kingdoms had bled heavily, not only in gold but in the lives of their sailors, soldiers, and civilians. The war had spilled far beyond the Channel and the North Sea, turning into a globe-spanning rivalry that had touched the shores of the Americas, the waters of the Caribbean, the harbors of the Azores, and the gates of Manila. But exhaustion, famine, and shifting politics were beginning to force both crowns to rethink the fight. In England, Elizabeth I's court was marked by a strange duality. Outward displays of triumph, yet behind the tapestries, a gnawing awareness that her treasury was strained to breaking. The war had created heroes like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, but it had also drained the coffers that funded England's navy. Many of her privateers, once gallant sea hawks, had turned to outright piracy when official commissions dried up. The Queen herself had grown older, her once unshakable political control subtly loosening as factions formed around potential heirs. Across the Bay of Biscay, Philip III, who had succeeded his father in 1598, inherited a Spain weary of war. The vast Spanish Empire, from the silver mountains of Potosi to the galleon routes of Manila, still stood immense, but its arteries were clogged by debt and overstretch. Armadas had to be rebuilt again and again. Ships rotted in port for want of funds, and Spanish merchants groaned under the constant threat of English and Dutch raiders. Yet, Spain still possessed unmatched colonial wealth and a disciplined navy capable of striking fear. The fighting, though smaller in scale, continued with deadly intent. In Ireland, the 9 Years' War reached its climax. The Spanish saw an opportunity to wound England by supporting the Gaelic Irish lords against Elizabeth's rule. In 1601, a Spanish expedition landed at Kinsale, a desperate gamble to open a second front. The English response was swift. Lord Mountjoy's army surrounded the town, and after a bitter siege, the Irish and Spanish forces were defeated. The dream of breaking England through Ireland faded, but the battle showed how deeply this conflict had reached into every corner of European politics. By 1603, the war's end was in sight. The death of Elizabeth I that March marked the passing of an era. Her successor, James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, inherited not only the English crown but the heavy burden of a 2-decade war. James, unlike Elizabeth, sought peace over glory. He opened negotiations with Philip III, both monarchs keen to restore trade and end the endless drain on resources. The Treaty of London, signed in 1604, formally ended the Anglo-Spanish War. The terms reflected the exhaustion of both sides. England agreed to cease its support for the Dutch revolt and refrain from direct attacks on Spanish possessions, while Spain recognized James I as the rightful king and restored trading rights. There were no grand territorial changes, no decisive victor's spoils, only the quiet, pragmatic end to a war that had reshaped navies, alliances, and imperial ambition. The legacy of the conflict, however, was immense. England had survived the might of Spain's fleets, proving itself a rising naval power. Privateering had seeded a generation of skilled seamen who would later push into colonization and global trade. Spain, though bloodied, remained a formidable empire for another century, but the war revealed cracks in its seemingly unshakable dominance. And so, the guns and galleons fell silent, not because the world had grown peaceful, but because both great powers needed to draw breath before the next storm. The sea, restless as ever, awaited the next sails to challenge the horizon. 1.